The air in conference room 3 was the color of stale coffee and tasted of institutional cleaner. It was a sterile box of beige walls and acoustic ceiling tiles, designed for PowerPoints and quiet capitulations. Colonel Marcus Vance felt the room's blandness seeping into his bones. He sat at the head of a polished mahogany table that reflected the merciless fluorescent lights above, his Class A uniform a slash of disciplined green and gold against the monotony. Opposite him, looking entirely too comfortable in a tailored Italian suit, was Mr. Sterling, a civilian contractor whose smile was as polished and empty as the table between them. Sterling's company, Aegis Dynamics, had sold the Army a $90 million K-9 development program. The dogs, a new Belgian Malinois hybrid bred for heightened sensory acuity, were magnificent physical specimens. They were also, to a one, spectacular failures. They were volatile, unresponsive, and in 3 cases had turned on their handlers. Sterling, with the unassailable confidence of a man who held the contract, was here to explain why the fault lay not with his product, but with the Army's people. Beside him, looking small and miserable, was Sergeant Miller, a young handler with honest eyes and the ramrod posture of a man trying not to break. At his feet, tethered to his chair, lay Ghost, the program's prize asset. The dog was a breathtaking animal, a sleek, sable-pelted creature of coiled muscle and unnerving intelligence. And right now, it was radiating an almost visible field of anxiety, whining low in its chest, its claws making tiny scraping sounds on the linoleum. And then, there was the old man. He sat in a cheap plastic chair against the wall, away from the table, as if he were part of the furniture. He hadn't been formally introduced. He'd simply been there when Vance had arrived at 0800, a note from General Hayes's office on his desk saying only, "Listen to him." He wore dusty work boots, faded denim, and a canvas jacket that had seen decades of hard weather. A dusty, nondescript ball cap shadowed a face carved from old wood, all deep lines and quiet patience. He hadn't said a word. He just sat, hands resting on his knees, his gaze moving with slow, deliberate economy from the contractor to the colonel to the dog. He looked like a local farmer who'd wandered in by mistake. Vance had already dismissed him, a courtesy to the general, nothing more. "Colonel," Sterling began, his voice smooth as oiled machinery. "The issue, as our data clearly indicates, is a crisis of confidence. Your handlers are approaching these animals with antiquated pack leader methodologies. These are not simple shepherds. They are finely tuned sensory instruments. They require, a more symbiotic approach." He slid a glossy brochure across the table. It was titled Aegis Symbiosis Protocol Trademark. It would, Vance knew, come with a hefty price tag for the retraining module. "My handlers are the best in the Army, Mr. Sterling," Vance said, his voice clipped. "Sergeant Miller has a decade of experience, 2 tours as a K-9 lead in hostile territory. He's not the problem." "With respect, Colonel, the evidence suggests otherwise." Sterling gestured to the restless dog. "Look at the animal. Stressed, disconnected. That's not a failure of genetics. It is a failure of leadership." Sergeant Miller flinched as if struck. He stared at his boots, his jaw tight. Ghost whined again, louder this time, a sound of pure distress. Throughout the exchange, the old man hadn't moved. His stillness was absolute, unnatural. It wasn't the stillness of boredom or fatigue. It was the stillness of a predator in a blind, every sense engaged, waiting. Vance found his eyes drawn to him, an irritating snag in his focus. The man's gaze was on the dog, and there was a quality to it, a profound, unnerving concentration that made the air around him seem to thicken. He looked at the dog not as an asset or a problem, but as if he were reading a page of complex text. "The general suggested you might have some insight," Vance said, turning to the old man, the words a perfunctory gesture of respect for his superior. He didn't expect a useful answer. The old man's eyes lifted from the dog and met Vance's. They were pale blue, the color of a winter sky, and seemed to see straight through the uniform, the rank, the carefully constructed authority. For the first time, Vance felt a flicker of something other than dismissal, a prickle of unease. The man's voice, when it came, was quiet, raspy from disuse. "Dog's not stressed," he said. Sterling let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Not stressed? Sir, the animal is practically vibrating with anxiety. My metrics." "He's bored," the old man interrupted, his voice flat, cutting through Sterling's condescension like a shard of glass. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The statement landed in the room with the weight of a physical object. "And he's confused. You've given him a world of new information and no dictionary to read it with." His gaze dropped back to the dog. Ghost, which had been agitatedly shifting its weight, suddenly went still. Its head cocked, its ears swiveling to lock onto the old man against the wall. The low whining ceased. The dog lowered its head slightly, its entire body language shifting from anxious confusion to focused inquiry. It was a change so subtle and so immediate that only a trained eye would catch it. Vance caught it. Sergeant Miller, whose eyes had been fixed on his dog, caught it too. He looked from Ghost to the old man, his expression one of pure astonishment. "And what precisely is your qualification to make that assessment?" Sterling asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Are you a veterinarian, a behavioral psychologist?" He looked the old man up and down, taking in the worn clothes, the calloused hands. "A farmer, perhaps?" The old man didn't answer. He didn't even look at Sterling. His focus remained entirely on the dog. He gave a slow, deliberate blink. Across the room, Ghost mirrored the gesture, its eyelids lowering and rising in perfect synchrony. Vance felt the hair on his arms stand up. It was impossible. A coincidence. It had to be. "I think," Vance said, his own voice sounding strange to him, "that we should see what you mean." He was no longer being polite. He was now deeply, urgently curious. The carefully ordered world of his command had just developed a crack, and this quiet, unassuming old man was standing right at its epicenter. Sterling scoffed again, but Vance silenced him with a look. "Sergeant Miller," Vance ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument, "unclip the leash." Miller hesitated for a fraction of a second, a flicker of professional doubt crossing his face. Letting a volatile 100-pound animal like Ghost off leash in a confined space was against every protocol he had ever learned. But the order had been given. He reached down, and with a quiet click, the brass clasp came free from the dog's collar. The room held its breath. Sterling took an involuntary step back, bumping into the credenza behind him. He was a salesman, not a dog man. The sudden presence of a loose, powerful animal had stripped away his veneer of control. Ghost stood up, shook its body once from head to tail, and took a tentative step forward. Its eyes never left the old man. The man in the dusty jacket still hadn't moved from his chair. He simply watched the dog approach. There was no tension in his body, no fear. He was a rock in a stream, letting the current move around him. Ghost padded silently across the floor, its nails making no sound on the tile. It stopped about 5 feet from the man's chair, lowered itself into a perfect sit, and waited. The posture was a textbook example of attentive submission, ears forward, tail still, eyes locked on the alpha. It was a level of immediate voluntary compliance that Sergeant Miller, with all his training and affection, had been trying to achieve for 6 months, and failed. The silence in the room was now absolute. The hum of the lights seemed to have receded. All Vance could hear was the sound of his own breathing. He was witnessing something that his training manuals had no explanation for. It was like watching a man speak a language only one other creature in the room understood. The old man slowly lifted his right hand, just a few inches from his knee. He didn't point. He didn't snap his fingers. He simply curled his index finger slightly, a gesture so small it was almost imperceptible. Ghost responded instantly. The dog rose, turned, and walked to the far corner of the room where a series of scent boxes had been set up for a planned demonstration. It ignored the boxes containing food distractions and common environmental smells. It went directly to the third box, the one containing a trace amount of a specific, inert chemical explosive used for training. It nudged the box with its nose once, then returned to the old man's side, sat again, and looked up, awaiting the next command. The entire sequence had taken less than 10 seconds. It was flawless. It was silent. It was impossible. Sergeant Miller was on his feet now, his mouth slightly agape. "Sir, how did you do that?" There was no command, no verbal, no hand signal I could see. The old man's gaze finally shifted from the dog to the young sergeant. A hint of something, not warmth, but perhaps approval, softened the hard lines of his face for a moment. "The signal was there," he said quietly. "You're just trained to look for a shout. All I did was whisper." Sterling, having regained some of his composure, saw his multi-million-dollar contract evaporating. "A trick," he sputtered, his voice high and thin. "A fluke. You've conditioned the animal somehow. This is irrelevant to the broader program failures." Vance had heard enough. He had seen enough. The world of brochures and bottom lines had just collided with something ancient and real, and the brochures had disintegrated on impact. He turned his full attention to the old man, his internal posture shifting from skepticism to a deep, resonant respect that bordered on awe. The general's note, "Listen to him," now felt less like a suggestion and more like a sacred order he had almost violated. "Sir," Vance said, and the honorific was no longer a formality. It was earned. "I apologize for my lack of attention. General Hayes said you were a consultant. He didn't specify in what." The old man gave a slight dismissive shrug, as if his identity were a matter of complete indifference. "I've done a bit of work with dogs over the years." A bit of work. The understatement was so profound, it was almost a physical force in the room. This was not a hobbyist. This was not a retired trainer. This was a master, someone who operated on a level of instinct and communication that Vance hadn't known existed. But Sterling wasn't ready to concede. His career, his company's reputation, was on the line. He strode forward, planting himself between Vance and the old man, his face flushed with anger and indignation. "This is absurd," he declared, his voice rising. "We're in a secure military facility discussing a critical defense contract, and you're taking the word of who, exactly? Who is this man? What is his clearance? What is his background? I have a right to know who is interfering with my project." He jabbed a finger toward the old man. "You, let's have it. What's your name? What was your rank?" The question hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. Sterling had meant it as an attack, a way to expose the old man as a nobody, an unqualified interloper. He had no idea he had just pulled the pin on a grenade. The old man's pale blue eyes settled on Sterling. There was no anger in them, no defensiveness. There was nothing at all. It was the calm, flat gaze of someone assessing a problem, and Sterling, for all his bluster, was just a piece of faulty equipment. Vance stepped forward. He felt a strange, protective instinct. He wanted to shield this quiet man from Sterling's abrasive ignorance, but he also needed the answer. The professional curiosity, the soldier's need for order and hierarchy, was too strong. "Sir," Vance said, his voice quiet but firm, turning to the old man. "With all due respect, mister, Sterling has a point, however poorly he's making it. For the official record, we do need to know. Who are you? What unit were you with?" He paused, then asked the question that mattered most in his world. "What was your rank?" The old man was silent for a long moment. The fluorescent lights hummed. The dog, Ghost, sat perfectly still at his feet, a silent testament to his authority. He seemed to be weighing not what to say, but whether to say anything at all. His gaze shifted from Sterling's indignant face to Vance's genuinely inquisitive one. He seemed to make a decision. He didn't look away from Vance. His voice remained low, without inflection, a simple statement of fact delivered into the superheated silence of the room. "There wasn't a rank," he said, the words precise, measured. Not in the traditional sense, it was a designation. He paused again. The pause stretched, pulling the tension in the room taut. Vance found he was holding his breath. Sergeant Miller was frozen, his eyes wide. Even Sterling seemed to realize he was on the edge of a cliff. Then, the final words. "Delta Force Actual." The silence that followed was not empty. It was a solid thing, a pressure change that made ears pop. The three words landed with no force, yet they cracked the foundation of the room. Sergeant Miller, a combat veteran, reflexively straightened his spine, his body snapping to a subconscious position of attention. Mr. Sterling's face went slack. the angry flush draining away to be replaced by a pasty, confused pallor. He didn't understand the words, not really, but he understood the effect they had on the soldiers in the room. Colonel Marcus Vance understood. He understood completely. Actual was not a casual term. It wasn't slang. It was a specific technical designator used in command and control communications. It meant the commander, not a representative, not a subordinate, not a staffer. The commander on the ground, or the final authority, the one who made the decisions that weren't in any manual. And to pair it with Delta Force, that meant this quiet, unassuming man in a dusty jacket had not just been a member of the most elite clandestine special operations unit in the world. He had led it. Vance felt a cold wave wash over him. He was a full-bird colonel, a man who had commanded battalions, who had the respect of generals. And he had spent the last hour in the presence of a living legend, treating him like an inconvenient piece of furniture. The gulf between the man's quiet exterior and the reality of his past was so vast, it defied comprehension. All the odd details suddenly clicked into place with the force of a rifle bolt locking home. The unnatural stillness, the economy of motion, the eyes that saw everything, the immediate instinctual deference of the highly bred dog. Ghost hadn't been responding to a farmer. It had been responding to the apex predator in the room, recognizing a level of command authority that transcended species. Vance's mind raced, trying to process the implications. The operators of that unit were ghosts. Their names were erased, their records sealed under layers of classification so deep that most of the military didn't even know they existed. They were the architects of modern special warfare. To have been actual was to have been at the very tip of the spear, a maker of history in shadowed places that would never appear on a map. "That's not possible," Sterling stammered, his voice a pathetic whisper. He was grasping for the world that had made sense to him 5 seconds ago. "Those records are sealed. No one just walks in here." Before Vance could respond, before he could even find his voice, the door to the conference room opened with a soft whoosh. A man in the uniform of a 4-star general stepped inside, his aide holding the door for him. It was General Hayes. He was in his late 60s, a man whose face was a map of command decisions, but he moved with a purpose that belied his age. He didn't acknowledge Vance or Sterling. His eyes went straight to the old man. A genuine warm smile broke across his face, a smile of reunion between equals. "Elias," the general said, his voice booming with unaffected warmth. He crossed the room in 3 strides and clapped the old man, Elias, on the shoulder. "Good to see you. Sorry I'm late. Had to pull your file from the deep archives. Caused quite a stir down at Records Command. They thought I was asking for the Holy Grail." Elias Thorne finally allowed himself a small ghost of a smile. "They always were dramatic, Robert." General Hayes chuckled. He turned his gaze on the rest of the room, and the warmth vanished, replaced by the icy appraisal of high command. He looked at Sterling's pale face, at Miller's awestruck expression, and finally at Vance's rigid posture. "Colonel," Hayes said, his voice now formal, "I trust Mr. Thorne has been illuminating." "Sir," Vance managed, his own voice tight. "Yes, sir, he has." Hayes nodded, then his eyes fell on the glossy Aegis Dynamics brochure on the table. He picked it up, glanced at it with open disdain, and let it fall from his fingers. It fluttered to the floor. "Sterling," the general said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "You're selling us a car without an engine. You've bred dogs that can hear a whisper at 1,000 yards, but you forgot to teach them the language. You've replicated the hardware, but you have no understanding of the operating system." He gestured with his chin toward Elias. "This man wrote the operating system." He walked to the table and placed a thin, black-bordered file folder on its polished surface. It was stamped with warnings. "Top secret //SCI//eyes only." "Project Chimera," General Hayes announced to the silent room. 1988. "The foundational program for all modern special operations, K9 units. We needed a dog that could operate autonomously, that could communicate with its handler non-verbally over significant distances. A dog that was less a tool and more a partner." He tapped the file. "Most of this is still classified, but the short version is this. It was his program. He didn't just run it, He conceived it, designed the protocols, selected the baseline genetics. He was the first handler. He wrote the book that everyone in your R&D department has been trying to read for the last 20 years, Mr. Sterling. Sterling looked like he was going to be sick. His entire business, his $90 million contract, was predicated on a pale, flawed imitation of the work done by the man he had just insulted and dismissed as a farmer. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was undone. Not by an argument, not by a legal challenge, but by a simple, quiet revelation of truth. He had tried to sell ocean water to the sea. Vance felt a profound sense of professional shame, followed by an overwhelming wave of reverence. He looked at Elias Thorne, at the worn jacket and the calloused hands, and he saw him for the first time. He saw the decades of silence, the weight of secrets carried, the quiet dignity of a man who had walked away from the pinnacle of power and chosen a life of anonymity. He hadn't come here to show off. He hadn't come to prove a point. He had come because a friend, a general, had asked for his help with a problem concerning the animals he had first brought into the fold. He stepped forward, stopping a respectful distance from Elias. "Sir," Vance said, his voice low and sincere, "on behalf of my command, I'd like to apologize. My assessment was inadequate." Elias Thorne looked at him, his pale eyes holding no judgment. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "You were doing your job, Colonel, assessing threats. It's what you're supposed to do." The simple absolution was more powerful than any formal pardon. He was acknowledging Vance's world, his duties, even as he stood completely outside of it. Elias then turned his attention back to the matter at hand, his focus shifting with practiced ease from the interpersonal to the technical. He looked at Sergeant Miller. "Your dog is fine, Sergeant," he said. "You're a good handler. You listen. You've just been given a bad map." He then looked at General Hayes. "The problem is the signal, Robert, not the dog. They've amplified the input frequency." He tapped his own temple. "It's like shouting into a microphone. All the dogs are hearing is static. You need to dampen the carrier wave, filter the noise." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He had identified the core problem in minutes, a problem that teams of scientists and trainers had been failing to solve for months. He had delivered the diagnosis and the prescription in 2 sentences. His work was done. Without another word, he bent down and placed a hand on Ghost's head. The dog leaned into his touch, its entire body relaxing in a sigh of pure contentment. He gave the dog a final gentle scratch behind the ears, a quiet dismissal. Then, he straightened up. He picked up his dusty cap from the chair, settled it on his head, and gave a single final nod to General Hayes. It was a nod between old comrades, freighted with decades of shared history that would remain unspoken. He turned and walked toward the door. He moved with the same unhurried, economical grace he had displayed all morning. No one spoke. No one moved to stop him. To do so would have felt like a sacrilege. The room was his, the silence a tribute to the gravity of his presence, and now to the finality of his absence. He didn't look back. The door swung shut behind him with a quiet click, and he was gone. He had arrived in silence, and he departed in the same way, leaving behind a room full of changed men and a legend that had briefly, quietly walked among them. The silence he left behind was heavier than the one that had preceded him. It was filled with the weight of what had just been revealed and then withdrawn. Finally, Sergeant Miller, his voice full of a young soldier's awe, spoke into the quiet. "Sir, was he for real?" he asked, looking at General Hayes. Hayes walked over to the window, looking out across the manicured lawns of the base as if he could still see the old man walking away. "More real than any of us, Sergeant," he said softly. "He was there at the beginning. He drew the maps everyone else now follows. When he retired, he asked for only one thing: to be forgotten. The government was only too happy to grant his request. It's easier to manage a myth than a man." Vance walked over to the table and picked up the classified file. The black ink of the warnings seemed to pulse with energy. He didn't have the clearance to open it, but he didn't need to. He had seen the living document. He understood now that the most dangerous men were not the ones who advertised their power. They were the ones who had no need to. The ones who wore their history not like a medal on their chest, but like the dust on their boots. He looked at Sterling, who had sunk into a chair, his expensive suit looking like a costume, his face the color of ash. His world of contracts and metrics had been rendered meaningless. He was a footnote in a story he hadn't even known was being written. Vance felt a flicker of pity for him, but it was fleeting. The man had flown too close to the sun, assuming it was just another light bulb. "Mr. Sterling," Vance said, his voice cold and official, "your presence is no longer required. My office will be in touch regarding the future of your contract." It was a formality. The contract was dead. Sterling nodded numbly, gathered his things with trembling hands, and scurried out of the room, a man thoroughly, comprehensively defeated without a single shot being fired. Now it was just Vance, General Hayes, and Sergeant Miller, with the dog, Ghost, who had lain down by the door, as if guarding the memory of the man who had just left. "What now, sir?" Miller asked the general. Hayes turned from the window. "Now, Sergeant, we follow his instructions. We fix the signal." He looked at Vance. "And you, Colonel, have a new mission. I'm putting you in charge of integrating the Chimera protocols, the real ones, back into the program. The file is yours. Your clearance will be adjusted by the time you get back to your office." Vance felt a jolt. It was an assignment of immense trust and historical significance. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me," Hayes said, a wry, sad smile touching his lips. "Thank him. He just saved the taxpayers $90 million and probably saved the lives of a few good soldiers down the line." He sighed, a sound heavy with memory. "He lives on a small farm up in the mountains. No phone, no internet, raises horses. If you didn't know, you'd never know. That's how he wants it." Vance nodded, understanding. The quiet exit was the final lesson. The man, Elias Thorne, hadn't needed their respect. He hadn't wanted their admiration. He had simply done what was asked of him and returned to his life, leaving them to grapple with the echoes of his passage. The meeting was over. General Hayes left, leaving Vance and Miller alone with the dog. Vance looked at the young sergeant who was still staring at the door, his expression one of profound reverence. "Did you see his hands, sir?" Miller asked quietly. "When he touched Ghost, there were no wasted movements. It was like watching water flow downhill, just correct." "I saw that, Sergeant," Vance replied. He looked down at his own hands, manicured and clean. He thought of Elias Thorne's, calloused and weathered by work. One set of hands signed memos and directives, the other had shaped the very foundations of his world. He walked over and knelt beside Ghost, running a hand over the dog's powerful back. The animal was perfectly calm now, its breathing deep and even. It looked up at Vance, and for the first time, Vance felt he was truly seeing the animal, the incredible potential that lay dormant within it, waiting for the right key. He finally understood. Elias Thorne was the key. He was the living Rosetta Stone for a language of silence, instinct, and absolute trust. And for a few brief moments on a Tuesday morning in a sterile conference room, Colonel Marcus Vance had been allowed to hear it spoken. The experience would change him forever. He stood up, the black file held tight in his hand, and knew that his real education had only just begun. The old man was gone, but his presence remained, a quiet, powerful standard against which Vance would measure himself and every soldier he commanded for the rest of his career. The farmer had taught the colonel that true authority is not worn on a uniform or shouted in a command, but carried in the quiet stillness of a man who knows exactly who he is.